We are pleased to welcome Kasia, who will be, I'm sorry, Kasia, I don't know how to say your last name.
That's okay. Kasia is totally good.
No, but tell me, I want to be able to say your last name.
Kasia Szczech is fine. Kasia Szczech.
Kasia Szczech. And she will be giving us a program about teaching music theory, circle of fifths, notation, and composition that engages the student to think creatively. So for those of you who value music theory and use it in your lessons with your students every day, it is essential that they understand what, how, and where all this material comes from and how it's all intertwined and how you can utilize it all together. Being a composer and loving music theory, Kasia saw that these kids need to know music theory from scratch. She is a composer and teacher, and we look forward to hearing her ideas. Please welcome Kasia Szczech.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Yumi. I will be presenting on how music theory should be fun, and how it should be presented from the very beginning with all of the basics, with all of the definitions, that we normally use in the music language. A lot of theory books, they do incorporate different music theory aspects into the lesson books. But a lot of the times we see the definitions being almost lowered down. So the definitions are not accurate as they should be, or they are presented in very confusing orders, such as introducing ties and slurs before the student even knows how to read the music, or introducing intervals before the child knows what a half step or whole step is. Such things as those. I have been doing so much research on many methods for the last 7 years. And I have developed my own method on how to teach music theory. So I welcome you, and I hope that you guys can grab some ideas from how I teach music theory in my lessons and how I have been doing this. And of course, with much research in my own lessons with my own students, trying many different ways and many different methods. This is the method that has been the most successful. And it's the one method that really engages the students and has them asking what, how, why, where, what is going on? And can you please explain this to me? Like, why is this like this? Earlier in different methods, the students I found were confused, going off of basic theory books, from many different method books that are available on the market. So this is what I came up with, and I hope that you guys can take away a little bit of it into your own lessons. And of course, I am willing to share any information and any of the worksheets that I will be presenting today. So, music theory, what is it? How do we use it? Where does it come from? Why do we use it? Well, of course, if we look at music theory simply, we know that it's the fundamental structure and elements of music. We use music theory to create, analyze, interpret the music, especially in the art of performance, which is what we all teach and sort of gather our students to at the end, right? We teach them all of these fundamentals, and at the end, we want our students to be able to perform the music, but we don't just want them to have the accurate notes and rhythm. We want them to really understand the music. But how can you understand music if you don't know where it comes from, how it's formed? What are the basics of music theory? How did the composer compose this? How did this all come together? So if we're looking, this is the order that I teach music theory in. Of course, a lot of you may have a very similar order: rhythm, notes, intervals. Right a little bit before intervals is whole steps and half steps, then going back into intervals, scales, melody, chords, chord progression and harmony, structure and form, and then understanding the use of harmony and modulation throughout the circle of fifths. So the next question is, where does it come from? Well, of course, music theory originated in ancient civilizations, particularly in Greece, and has evolved over time. So a little bit of history going back into our music degrees and all of the early music history lessons that we've all taken. The Greeks developed a system of modes using their knowledge of tunings, intervals, and scales. And this very basically correlates into how we teach music, right? In the Middle Ages, music theory was refined, and the play on polyphony was the trend in composers. In the Renaissance period, harmony, melody, rhythm, and form were developed into common practice as we see music written today. New musical instruments were being developed, and standard notation was being born around the 15th, 16th centuries. In the Baroque era, we finally see the circle of fifths and the tonal center standardized as majors and minor scales. In the classical era, the tonal system was crystallized, bringing more focus on how to play with rhythm, melody, and harmony. And then, of course, throughout the Romantic, Impressionistic, 20th, 21st centuries, modern eras, these concepts have completely evolved. So contemporary classical music utilizes the very basic forms of the fundamental music, and as I like to call it, it tries to twist all of the elements to the possible extreme. So what do I mean by that? As a composer in today's time, and as a composer who has composed and has lived in the contemporary classical world for a bit, with doing many projects with Don Niente from Chicago and Greece Ensemble, a lot of many ensembles in Greece. That's kind of where I have gotten pulled into at first to Sonart. We've developed, we've messed with, and we've broken all the rules till this day. So that's how I like to think about it. We've, over so many periods and eras, we've literally just kept taking the music and trying to find new ways. And today like I said, we've developed, messed with, and broken all the rules as of today. So composers today are trying to find a way to restructure the fundamental concepts of music theory, as there are no more rules to break in the traditional concepts. And so taking that into mind on how we teach music theory, I think it's really important to understand the historical background of where we would start from the Greeks into where we are in the present day, and how kids need to understand, or students need to understand, where the fundamentals of music theory belong in music being written by composers today, and music being written by, you know, from the Baroque, classical, Romantic eras, like we do teach, of course. How do we utilize it? Well, we utilize music theory by applying it to the music we are studying and learning. Very basic. The goal at the end is to be able to interpret a piece of music and be able to perform in that interpretation, meaning every decision you've made on every note is performed to make meaning to an audience member. So how can you interpret something if you don't understand the fundamental basics of how the piece was composed? Well, simply, theoretically, you can't. Although some would argue that you can use human emotion and imagination to create your own concept of how the music should sound in specific places. But will that interpretation be correct based on the given circumstances of the composition and what compositional techniques are used? But again, some would argue, but isn't art abstract? Meaning everyone can interpret art in their own way and use their own imagination. So isn't that what happens when we perform a piece? We can make 8 out of 10 people feel an emotion intentionally, but will that emotion be the same for everyone? No, but because simply put, every human is different, right? But yet, aren't we supposed to understand every concept of technique and have the skills to be able to take something apart and be able to put it back together with meaning? It's kind of an oxymoron in itself. I know that is a lot of words that just came out of my mouth. If anybody has any questions, please, I welcome you. So a very simple example on how we restructure music theory in our lessons is a child has a toy. This toy is very colorful and it's very fun to look at. And of course, this is taking inspiration from my 2-year-old, who's a very creative and curious little Rugrats. Does this child admire this toy? Does it understand what the meaning and purpose of this toy is? Is this toy meant to be taken apart? The child doesn't bother with the fact of whether it's meant to be taken apart or not. The child ends up with multiple pieces of the toy. The child is curious, right? The child is curious. It doesn't care whether what the purpose of is. It wants to take it apart. It's curious. So it goes ahead and takes the toy apart. The child ends up with multiple pieces of the toy and challenges itself to put it back together successfully. The child may not be successful, or it may be successful, depending on how the child has taken it apart and what pieces and parts of it has remembered. Now, the question is, did the child gain appreciation for this toy and how it's built? Can the child appreciate playing with this toy now? Or did it have greater appreciation before the toy was taken apart? And that's kind of a question for ourselves to ask. In my opinion, if we're looking at as a metaphor of how music theory works, of course, in my own experience of taking things apart and putting them back together, I gain more appreciation for how that toy is meant to be played with. And I can find my own ways that this toy could be played with. And I can find my own ways on how to reconstruct this toy if I take it apart, like a puzzle. So then we go into why do we utilize music theory? Of course, talking about composition today in our meeting, which is a very big topic, we utilize music theory in all its fundamental concepts to help us understand what the composer wants, how the composer feels, why the composer chose these notes, that rhythm, that harmony, that progression, to that structure, and I can keep going on. Why did the composer modulate? Why are any of these composers' decisions important? So we want our young students to be asking these questions and answering them with the skills they've developed studying music theory. We want our students to analyze music and to give their full attention to what this composer is doing with this music. The students learn something new every time they do this. And of course, not only do they start to slowly learn new compositional techniques, but new techniques and skills on their instruments to create different colors and sounds they aim to interpret in their final performance. So basically, the way that I teach music theory and the method that I've developed is, in order for a student, let's say we're talking ages 7 to 8 and up, depending on where the children is in their skill level and how early they've started in their lessons. My experience is that you have to teach the student all of the different technical skills that a composer would use at hand, and they need to have that mastered in order for them to be able to reciprocate in that and be able to analyze that in the music that they are performing. So, getting into music theory. How do we teach this music theory, right? Well, music theory should be fun, first of all. I love music theory, and I think it is amazing. I have an absolute blast sitting with a piece of manuscript and analyzing it and finding many different units and everything involved in the music. That is what I do for fun. So I've created the Magical Keys method, which is a method specifically designed to accommodate all types of learners, teaching the basics from the very beginning to achieve a successful music theory learning journey. Now, this method is for all types of kids, so it is very accommodating. So kids who learn visually, kinesthetically, orally, through reading and writing. There is also lots of colors involved, so kids who learn by color. And there are many different fun ways to learn each of the topics of music theory. This method also accommodates all teachers who have different methods and styles of teaching. So a lot of teachers have different viewpoints on what fun can be in lessons. Every teacher has their own perspective on how to teach their lessons, but if there is a good base for what is to be taught, any teacher can succeed in teaching the fundamentals in the most effective way. So that is the goal here. If we look at the circle of fifths, the circle of fifths is a complex structure that demonstrates major and minor. So showing and explaining to a student what the circle of fifths is and showing them how it works, right? So we have, of course, we can say that the circle of fifths is a giant circle that involves major and minor scales. Now, in order to make this a little bit more fun, I've come up with this concept of the circle of fifths being these towns that are spread apart by 5 miles. And there is this train that picks up these passengers, and the passengers being the sharps and flats. And once they get through half of the circle to G flat major, F sharp major town, they start dropping them off. And so we see less and less. And so these sharps convert into flats. And so this is the game that we play. First, of course, it's very important to explain to the child what major scales sound like and what minor scales sound like. And of course, using words such as major towns are happy, joyful, and cheerful, and minor towns are sad and emotional. So how this game that I use works to teaching this music theory is, number one, the train starts at C major town. Next, the train always travels 5 miles north, which is up an interval of a fifth to the next town. Each sharp is a new passenger on board, so the more sharps, the more passengers you have on your train. You will get to name each of the passenger and then give them an outfit. So in G major town, we have F sharp Frank, or it can be F sharp Francesca. It really depends on the child. And it's very fun to then say that all of the passengers on the sharp side of the circle of fifths live a half step away or a half step down from the G major town center. So this also is introducing them concepts of intervals and half steps and whole steps from the very beginning. Every town is different from one another, so be creative when arriving at the new town. For example, in one town, there are chocolate houses and another has flying piano cars, or so you can be very creative and you can let the child remember what each scale town is called. Then the train turns around at G flat F sharp town and gets ready to head back to C major town. Here the passengers transition enharmonically. So once we get to that point, we start to work on all the different types of enharmonics, introducing double sharps, double flats. So the child is more aware, the student is more aware of how all of the enharmonics work in music. And then once you head back home, you will then move to minor towns and then learn your minor scales. So in my opinion, mixing major and minor scales in the beginning is very confusing. When I do teach the major scales in the circle of fifths first, there are moments where you do have to mention the minor scale and what the relative, minor of that major is, but we don't go into detail. I do mention that it is a different formula, which I'll teach you in just a little bit. And if the student is curious on that spot and I see the student is not overwhelmed, I will show them how to develop a minor scale, and they will already know what to do with it due to the experience of what I'm about to show you. So that's kind of the cool thing about how this works. Whoops. There we go. So going into how intervals work. So I did mention I use lots of colors, and these are simple worksheets that I've made that I'm showing you on how I like to utilize these different concepts and fundamentals of music theory. So using half steps as red and using whole steps as blue, and then using the different colors of the notes notated on the staff and having them actually play these intervals that are the half steps that are listed on the graph that you see, and then having them taking a pencil and actually writing their own half steps in. So they need to find the half steps without my help at that point. Once they understand the concepts of half steps, you throw them in the deep water and have them do it. So they need to learn how to notate that. Not only are they learning how to write notes on the staff, they are learning the stem positions, they are learning everything else that needs to be taught in the notation. Now, this is very helpful for kids who are visual, kinesthetic, and of course, looking at this, learn by color, are visual learners, and of course, kids who learn by writing. So you have all the different types of concepts of how every child could be learning, and you're applying that all into one. The same thing goes into whole steps. If anyone's interested in these worksheets, I am happy to send them out. Going into the scale. So now that we've reviewed how our whole steps and half steps work, a lot of method books like to use whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. A lot of that times, especially in my own experience, sharing that with students and using that in lessons. Now, this goes from my experience with my students. Of course, there are so many different kids, and all of us have many different types of kids that we teach. It might work for some, it might not work for everybody. I found that just teaching them the numbers and being very mathematical, because music is numbers in the end, if you do think about it. Sticking to numbers and really making it as simple as you possibly can with numbers really does help. So the first question, what is a scale and where does it come from? A lot of the kids say that. Okay, great. A lot of us show our students what a scale is, but do we really show them where it comes from, how it's developed? Showing them what scales degrees are, you know, the octave, 1 to 8, and then just remembering that, teaching them what the definition of a scale is, right? There's a formula that stays the same for all major scales. It's almost like a skeleton. Our skeleton and our bones are all called the same, but the skin, the eyes, the hair, the nose, the lips, and all the features is what make us. So the skeleton is where the half steps are, 3, 4, 7, 8. The rest are all whole steps. Just remember 2 groups of numbers, 3, 4, 7, 8. Major scale, that's it. And whatever, all the letters that come with it, using this formula, that's what represents the skin, the hair, the nails, everything else that we need to incorporate and make that scale. Like we, as a composer, of course, we know, I always forget the word for this, but I'm sure some of you will know. Some composers see in colors. So some composers, I don't know if any of you, when you hear a pitch or if you hear a scale, you correlate those pitches or different scales with colors. I always forget what the name of it is. I know a composer, Morgan Krause, who has this, and it was funny.
Is it synesthesia, Kasia?
Yes. And she said that I had many workshops with her years ago, where we were collaborating on projects, and she said that it's like living in prison, you know. It's like she can't see any other colors. She wants to see different colors, but she can't. And so yeah, anyway, so going back to the scale, this is so if you explain the scale in this way, and if you sort of correlate and keep it very simple with numbers, the students tend to remember this a little bit easier, and they see the structure of how it's formed and where it comes from. This is the base of where a scale comes from. Now, I do love to mention that the scale is like a gem. It's like a diamond that has been sitting and fermenting. And this gem and this diamond has many different things that can come out of it. You can structure the scale. You can pull information out of the scale. There's so much inside the scale. It's so compact. And that's what's so special about the scale, right? So of course, then I have my students try by learning and by writing the scale out for themselves, color-coded, of course, using the blue as whole steps and the red as half steps. And then this is for grand staff. So then the student writes the fingerings for the right hand and then the fingerings for the left hand. Of course, that goes in with the teacher. The teacher teaches the fingerings. Next, we go on and we show them the more complex side of intervals. So now that they understand where the basic, intervals, you show them the intervals. You say, of course, 1 to 2 is a second, 1 to 3 is a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. And that is very basic to understand in a C major scale. A lot of method books do introduce that, right? So now let's play seconds, now let's play thirds, now let's play fourths, without getting into the major and minor side of seconds, thirds, and sixths and sevenths. Once they understand where that basic concept comes from, which it comes from the scale, You show them the difference between a C major scale interval and a C minor. They might not understand the C minor scale yet, but if you show them the difference of the different types of intervals that are and why there are major and minor scales, why there are major intervals and minor intervals, because kids will usually ask, well, why do you say perfect fourth, perfect fifth? And then why is like, do the seconds have a name? Do the thirds? Well, yes, they do. They have major and minor. They have, you can even say that it's a diminished, right? You can say it's augmented interval, especially for fourths and fifths. That's how we speak about these intervals. So showing them this and explaining just how the difference is between and where those intervals come from the different scales, major versus minor, really helps them understand now the structure that you've built within the circle of fifths and why that scale is so important. Of course, it's all number-based again, right? Now, going into melodic versus harmonic. So we get deeper into the intervals, right? We have major seconds. They've learned how to speak about the intervals. They know that it's now a major second. They know it's a major third, a major sixth, major seven. It's a perfect eighth, perfect fourth, and a perfect fifth. And I quiz them. I go, okay, what are the major intervals? What are the perfect intervals? And I have them close their eyes and I just have them recite it so that they understand and so that they know the information. Why I think it's important for a lot of students to understand melodic versus harmonic. Well, from day one, a lot of method books, of course, introduce homophonic types of pieces, right? Once the child has learned right hand separately, left hand separately, or if you start teaching both hands separately, depending on which method you use, you start with very basic homophonic music, the right hand and the melody in the right hand, the accompaniment in the left hand. So melody, explaining harmony, making sure that that student understands from that point on what the definition of a melody and harmony is and how that correlates to intervals. So that way, opening up a piece of music, are there any intervals you see that are harmonic? Are there any intervals that you see that are melodic? Lots of method books do this too. Just depends on where in the book you are, correct? I know that the Alfred series introduces that pretty early on in book one, in the lesson book one. So then showing them these different types and then having them actually write them in. So doing a little sorts of tests. And I know this seems like a lot of information, and I know that it seems like, well, there's so much writing. You can have the students do this at home, or you can spend 7 to 10 minutes at the beginning of each lesson covering each of these topics. Of course, it's over time. You're not going to teach all of this in one lesson. But having them physically sit down and start notating, start writing, having them label things. What kind of interval? Is it major or is it perfect? Reiterating that these intervals are only from the C major scale because the C major scale is so special. Whatever the C major scale gives us, that's what we take. Of course, then having them notate. So teaching them how to notate, which is having them think like a composer. Once again, what types of value notes am I going to use? Am I going to use quarter notes, half notes, whole notes? A lot of students, that's like the biggest decision of their life. Like they don't know whether they're going to be using quarter notes or whole notes right now. So it's really important for them to start making these decisions very early on. Going on, once we learn our intervals, we go into chords, which is even more complex. Now, so I always go back to this question. So what is a scale? Well, a scale is a series of notes in an octave where there are whole steps and half steps. The half steps happen at 3, 4, and 7, 8 scale degrees, and the rest are whole steps. How can we utilize the scale, and what is the scale needed for? Well, we have intervals that come out of that come up from this scale. We have chords that come from the scale, and then we have so many other things that come from the scale. These are just levels and levels that pile on. It gets deeper. We're digging a deeper hole into what a scale is and what kind of information we can pull from it, how we can utilize it. So looking at chords. What else can we say? Well, chords, of course, showing them another formula. and explaining a chord. So in the beginning, I mentioned that the scale is like a skeleton, right? It's a formula. So we introduce more formulas, keeping it all very mathematical. I found it's the best way for kids to learn. And explaining that a chord is a harmonic structure that consists of 3 notes this time. They've learned that a harmonic interval consists of 2 notes at once. Now they're learning that a chord consists of 3 notes playing at once, and that is deeper harmony. A chord is found in a scale by finding the scale degrees 1, 3, 5, or stacking thirds. But what is a chord and why is there so many? A lot of kids always say, well, are there different types? Well, yes, there are major, minor, diminished, and augmented chords that exist, right? We start doing these chords, and I explain what the major chord is, minor chord is, and of course, introducing the mathematical side of how we speak about chords. So a major chord is 1, 3, 5, and I ask them, find any chord. Of course, they're going to find a C major chord because they're learning about the C major scale first. So I say, find 1, 3, 5. Great. Now, they know their whole steps and half steps. And I'm sure that at this point, of course, I teach them when learning whole steps and half steps, I automatically teach them what sharps and flats are because the definition of a flat is a half step down. The definition of a sharp is a half step up. A lot of methods kind of lower the definition and say, let's say a sharp is a step to the right or a flat is a step to the left. But does the child really understand what that step is? Because a step to the right can be any step. It could be a half step, it could be a whole step. So this is where I don't agree on some methods, and this is why I try to be very strict with what definitions and how I'm defining them. Even it's a 7-year-old, you know, I want that 7-year-old to know that a sharp is a half step up, because then when we're talking about flats and sharps, especially when we're this deep into theory, learning about chords, they understand the concept of a sharp and a flat. A minor chord is 1, flat 3, 5. So they find, I'm like, okay, find the 1, find the 5, since it stays the same, now flat the 3. So they understand that concept and they can find a C minor chord very easily. And they understand that that third, C to E flat, is a minor third. A diminished chord, 1, flat 3, flat 5. Augmented chord, 1, 3, sharp 5. And this is how I talk to all my students. And I have them reciprocate this back to me. So I quiz them randomly. Okay, let's say we have a chord in the music. What kind of chord is that? And they already know. They play it. Oh, it's a diminished, 1, flat 3, flat 5. And so that's the language that they're starting to use. They're not saying, oh, it's a diminished chord. It's a C, E flat, and a G. They already know that. They're using the numerical system to understand how this diminished chord is formed using the scale degrees from the scale. So I find that being the most important part of my teaching in theory, using the numerical system to really, really, really dig into their brains how we think about music theory. Of course, getting into Roman numerals, I have them practice uppercase, lowercase Roman numerals. And of course, when we think about chords, we think about, of course, analyzation. So we need to know how to write Roman numerals when we're asking our students to analyze music, right? This is especially important for AIM tests and AIM exams, especially when we're asking our students to analyze any type of music for any testing that is coming up, or just for fun, like me. But I mean, some students, of course, will enjoy it, and some students will be like, are you kidding me? You're gonna make me analyze music for fun? Well, yeah. So notating these chords on the staff, finally, and showing them what these chords look like stacked, the stacking thirds, and labeling them. C major, which is uppercase Roman numeral, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, since they already know that it's stacking thirds. And of course, in this process, I explain, okay, well, the C major is going to start on 1. And of course, it's always going to be 1, 3, 5, the stacking thirds. If we're trying to find the 2 chord, well, we're going to start on scale degree 2. And the numbers are going to be 2, 4, 6, because we're following the numerical formula of 1, 3, 5, or stacking thirds, which is just skipping thirds. So they understand that concept of the minor 3 chord will be starting on scale degree 3. And of course, it will be skip, skip. So that is the basic structure of chords. One question that kids always ask is, why is the 7th all diminished? Like, why is the 7th always diminished? Why can't it be any other chord? So, well, that is how we find it. right? So going back to this concept of why the scale is important, using only what we are given, using only the notes that we see, remembering that the scale is like a pyramid with many secret pathways that lead to really cool things inside. So that seventh always ends up being a diminished because of the way that we find the information inside the scale. Of course, we get deeper into chords. We teach blocked chords. We have them notate. I have them write out all of the, again, practicing writing out all of the letters in the chords with all of the appropriate Roman numerals, having them write out blocked chords. And then, of course, teaching arpeggios and having them notate the arpeggios. And then, of course, teaching them inversions. So inversions are very important. A lot of beginner music, going into intermediate, we see lots of arpeggiated music, right? So especially in the right hand, teaching arpeggios, in the left hand, and arpeggios. So it's very important explaining and then having them notate how to write all of these inversions in all of the chords of the scale. Now, I know that I'm talking a lot about writing, but I also have every single time my students complete any of this information, they have to go home and practice it. It's not only being written, right? In order for them to actually digest it, they have to go home and practice this material in order for it to be digested into their muscles, into their brains, in order for them to actually understand it. So they will write this and they will fill out and they will write and notate these inversions beautifully. And I'm going to go home and I'm going to tell them, go home and practice this every single day as a warm-up now. And so every week they have a different warm-up and it's based on music theory. Of course, you can apply technique and skill to it, right? How to play chords, because that's obviously just like every other teacher has different techniques of how to play chords. You're working on technique, skill, and showing them how to digest, really, really understanding the material that you're giving them. So then going into this whole game concept, I know that I've talked a lot. I've kind of showed you how I teach theory in those levels that I've kind of spoken about. If we go to the first stop, that would be C major town in the circle of fifths. And so I like to, like I said, I like to call them towns. And then I say, all aboard, yeah, we're going to C major town. Now, does this town have any passengers? The passengers are notes that are sharps and flats, like mentioned earlier. Well, we already know that in completing the C major scale that there are no passengers on board. This town is a desert island or outer space or the North Pole where no one lives. And so the kid kind of gets these ideas of like, oh, no one lives here. It's a desert island. So when we go in, I of course have them notate all of this and then I have them go practice. I have them put in the scale using their half steps and whole step knowledge. I have them do their intervals major perfect, and then I have them notate the melodic and harmonic so that, again, that's being digested by writing. And then they go home and they actually practice it. Chords. I have them write out the letters of the chords one more time. I have them notate the blocks in arpeggio. And then, of course, playing the scale. So this is where we get really excited. There are no passengers, sharps, or flats. This town could be a desert, the North Pole, anything you wish. Write down 3 characteristics about this town. That's the first thing they do. And they get so excited about it because they're like, oh, okay, well, this, you know, since there's no one who lives here, there could be like piano-shaped tumbleweed that like, you know, flies across the plains of C major town, right? So that's the fun aspect. Number 2, notate the C major scale going up and down, 1 octave on the first staff and 2 octaves on the second staff using quarter notes in 4/4 time. A lot of us, and of course I used to do this, I used to buy scales and arpeggio books, and I used to just open up to C major and I'd have the students play C major. It's great that they're playing C major and it's great that they can play a 2 octave C major scale, but do they know how to notate one? So now, since they've been notating without any time signature or key signatures, now it's time to put it to the test. You have a time signature, use the 4/4. Remember to put in that time signature, draw bar lines. Number 4, write in the fingerings under each note of the scale for your instrument and then play the scale 10 times every day. Having them physically sit down and notate the scale really, 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 really is important because they learn. This is the same thing as taking the toy apart and then putting back together. Sometimes students do things that they don't even know that they're doing wrong. And of course, we as teachers have to fix it. But simple examples, I can show you of notation. So they might not align their notes. So when they're notating, the right hand and left hand might not be aligned perfectly. And so they write out this whole scale where the right hand is like here, this long, and the left hand ends here. Then they're trying to play it and they're like, I'm so confused. I'm like, well, your notes aligned? And so one notation, thinking like a composer, making the score as neat as possible. And they might forget their time signature. So they write their bar lines in random places. This is also confusing. And then, of course, making the decision of whether they're using quarter notes, half notes, whole notes, the biggest decision of their lives, and how they're going to utilize the time signature in writing this. So where they're going to put the bar lines, how neat their score is going to be. So they really start to gain respect for the position of a composer in the first place. The goal is for them to write it so neatly that they can go home and actually read the music and practice it. And it's fun for them. It's fun to go home and play a C major scale that they've written and that they're so proud of because they spend so much time using perfect lines and perfecting what their scale is going to look like. Then chord progressions, the next topic. So of course, analyzing the harmony in music. I like to give them very, very, very simple lead sheets that they can work with. Having the right hand play a simple melody that they already know, usually in the beginning. And everything that they've learned about chords is now being put into practice. So they have blocked chords that are given to them. They have many different inversions. They have to write in the type of inversion. So they have to write whether it's a root, first inversion, second inversion, which a lot of them usually, if they're doing this for the first time, they will look at it, they will sit and they will play and they will think about it for a second to see which inversion it is. They get very good at it the deeper they go. And then of course they have to analyze it in Roman numeral. So if it's a C major chord and we're in a C major scale, that C is going to be an uppercase Roman numeral. So it gives them a chance to practice Roman numeral analysis from the way beginning. Going into composition, once they are able to play that lead sheet and they practice it and they understand now how to read a lead sheet and how the harmonic progression works for Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, they can go home and use that chord progression to compose their own melody using chord tones. So by this time, they've learned what chord tones are, meaning that the harmony and melody work together. This gives them a totally new insight on how to analyze music and how the music is being written. They go into their own music and they're like, what? The notes in the right hand are the same harmony as the notes in the left hand? Yes, they are, right? So all of that starts to click slowly and surely. And so that analyzation and them, their perception of harmony and that harmony progressing is finally starting to click slowly but surely. You give them a chance to compose their own melody and you give them structure. So using the chord progression provided below, compose your own melody using only quarter, half, and whole notes. Give them restrictions. Make sure that the notes in the melody are also present in the chords given, so chord tones. Play your melody in the right hand and the chords in the left hand. They can go home, they can compose, they write down the Roman numeral analysis below, and you can use this as another 10-minute activity at your next lesson. What have you come up with? A composition lesson. Now, introducing passing notes. What are passing notes? How are passing notes used in music? Once you explain that, they can go into their final draft. So once they go into their final draft and they learn passing notes, there's so many things that they can do. And again, I give them restrictions. Edit your composition and add 5 passing notes to your melody using 1/8 notes only. So this really restricts them and tells them, okay, where am I going to put these passing notes? How am I going to utilize this? And of course, this teaches them accompaniment as well. Because if they're only going to copy what the chord progression was in the beginning, where they're only going to use the blocked chords that you've given them, the teacher can then show them different ways to accompany, right? You can use arpeggios, or you can do this, or you can do it on bum, 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 bum. And this gives them an idea of what they want their melody to sound like, what kind of emotion. So this really starts to brainstorm and tells them oh, how do I want this piece to be performed? Like, what do I want this piece to sound like? So the interpretation starts to then build. And you start to see how the child gets super creative and super into this. And it's like, well, I kind of want this to sound happy. Of course, they're going to use a lot of adjectives. I want this to sound happy, but then I want it to sound angry here. And then I want this chord to be really loud. And then I want the rest to be really soft. So you show them different accompaniment ways and you have them notate it. And that is their final composition. And of course, there's always a challenge at the end. Where you challenge them to compose their melody, but with a different harmonic progression. So then, of course, they're taking apart the harmonic progression you've given them, and they're using different chord structures and different chords to see what works for them and what harmonies they're going to use based on the melody that they've written. So, going into the whole composition aspect, are your students able to add in passing notes into their final draft? Teaching passing notes and having your students identify passing notes in their pieces is crucial, especially when analyzing harmony and chord tones. Are your students also able to come up with a catchy accompaniment for their final draft of their melody, meaning instead of just copying the chord progression like I just mentioned? And then the last point, this is where the student really learns to imagine what their piece wants to sound like. So I've kind of mentioned that, sorry. Once we are done, that is sort of what I do in each scale, and that's sort of my formula for teaching music theory in a very fun way. I know that we haven't had any passengers yet, but if we're looking at the passengers, let's say we go into G major town, our first passenger is F sharp. That passenger lives a half a step down the block from the G major train station. All the new passengers live a half step down from the town's train station, so reiterating that. And of course, when we see the scale portion, when I get into writing out the scales, I always have a little stick figure here. And this is where they can name their passenger. So they can give them an outfit. They can give them a name. So F sharp, any name that starts with an F. And it's really funny because once they write in and notate all of the stuff, they start playing. And of course, some students are so focused on reading the music and like, you know, paying attention to the fingering, they sometimes forget the accidentals, correct? I mean, every kid does it. So in this case, to make it fun, I say, oh no, F sharp, Frank, you know, he fell down and he hurt his knee. And so then they're like, oh no, I can't forget F sharp Frank. And so they start again. And you know, they get really creative, and then they get into broken arms and, you know, broken legs, and it gets really funny every time. And then of course, the deeper we go, so if you go into D major town, they remember that F sharp Frank is already on that train. And so we've picked up C sharp Curtis, for example. I don't know, that's been a very common name in my studio lately. A very old name that we don't hear often, Curtis. But F sharp Frank and C sharp Curtis, do they like each other? Do they sit close to each other on the train? I mean, it turns into like this dramatic fiasco, and then they come up with these amazing stories. But they remember that D major has two sharps, and it's F sharp Frank and C sharp Curtis, right? So that's kind of how I teach music theory. If we're looking at the continuation, having the students complete this exercise in every key of the major and minor scales, it really allows the student to digest and learn each scale and key individually. So you really dig into each scale. It's not opening up a book and having, oh, play the C major scale, play the D. You can do that later. Have them digest and have them really, really see what it feels like to be inside that scale and pull all the information that they possibly can out of that scale and learn everything that they need to know about it. Not only playing, but notating it and being able to digest all of the information, going home and practicing it. When you study a piece of music in your lesson in any major or minor key, you will find that your student identifying these concepts and asking questions such as what, how, why, where. I've been saying that the entire presentation, right? Where does it come from? How does it work? How can we utilize this, right? And we're always going back to, oh, I remember this from this piece. I remember this from this piece. They'll literally pull music, pull sheets of music that they've played, and they'll be like, oh, that happened here, you know? It really motivates them to do that too, because otherwise, the student won't think about it and it won't remember different parts, right? They won't be motivated or inspired to look for these things in the music that they're performing. The key here is to give the student a chance to do the work a composer would. and learn the necessary concepts a composer has to have mastered in order for the student to be able to understand the piece they're playing. Then focus on how they want it to sound and work on the performance of the piece. So going back to that child metaphor, taking it apart, putting it back together. So later they start to go into the piece they are performing, and they're taking their piece apart by using all of these skills that they've learned from the scale that they're playing in, or that scale that piece is in, learning compositional techniques as well, right? Why did the composer do this? Why did that's not traditional. Why is that chord here? This chord doesn't belong in the D major scale, you know? So they start to show signs of what they already understand. Yeah, so the magical key the conclusion here really is that every teacher teaches differently, and this method is flexible to fit any style of teaching. Like I said, I'm happy to share any of this with you guys. And of course, I'm sure, I hope that maybe every teacher who is here can sort of take little bits and pieces of this method and sort of use them in their lessons. Some of us have 30, 45 minutes, 60 lessons, but at least, you know, timing it out and using this as 5-10% of each lesson, it will really bring your students to be really curious little creatures. This helps, this method will fit kids who are naturally more gifted and kids who are struggling. And I can tell you that all from my own experience, that even kids who we all have those kids where they don't seem to quite get things right at the fingertips sometimes, and we have to repeat ourselves. And then we, of course, have kids who just grasp things right away. And then we have kids in the middle. So this method I found from my own experience, using this for many years and doing my own research on these kids that I've been teaching with this method, that this does really, even for the kids who it takes a couple times, it will take them a couple times at the beginning, but they will start to think and they will start to learn this way, and they will really start grasping this material faster because they will start to see patterns. And I found that that is what is most useful about this, is that it's the patterns for those kids. This is something funny. I taught my husband, he's an amazing musician, he's a bassist, but he's an amateur folk musician who learned by ear his whole life. Of course, we are Polish and we come from the Highland Mountains, from the Tatra Mountains, so we are Highlanders, and he's a folk musician. He's never learned how to read music, and neither were our grandparents. My sister and I are the first ones who went to any kind of music conservatory in our family. But I started teaching him to read music, and then I used this method on him slowly but surely. Husbands can be a little stubborn sometimes, especially when you're trying to teach them your craft. But he is literally so happy that he learned this concept, and it's so much easier for him to learn music now. So of course he's the bassist in our orchestra, and he's just, I mean, it's amazing to see the difference. It only took 8 years, but it worked. Of course, our students need to learn music theory in order for the arts of music to survive. I feel like the respect for music today and for the respective composers has gone down quite a bit. It really depends on what area of people you are living with and working with as well. But that we've seen over the years that, of course, I mean, over really honestly the last decade, a couple decades, that, you know, especially classical music has their own like clique or group of people that do still admire it, and then we look at the other the general population of the generations, and it's people don't even know what a duet is. You know, you have to explain it. Well, a duet or a trio is two people, a trio is 3 people. So it's sad to see this, but the more we teach our younger generations how to speak about music and how to respect it, they don't have to go on to be performance majors. They can be surgeons and still be able to play the piano in the lobby of the hospital that they work in, and utilize music as a craft that, you know, relaxes their muscles when they go into surgery. And I always say smart artist equals smart art. So if we start our young generations teaching them the smart way, then we will have smart artists in the future, and we will have smart art in the future, and that art will It will pierce through all the other generations. I like to laugh about it, and I always tell my students that my job as a teacher is to make them tiny little nerds, and they always laugh about it, and they're like, "We're not nerds." I'm like, "Yes, you are. Yes, you are." And some of them are proud to be nerds, and they walk around and they're like, "I'm a music nerd." So, I guess that's it. I want to thank you all, and I hope that you guys were able to take at least something out of this. I know that this was a lot of talking. I hope that I was able to bring a little bit of different perspective to all of your upcoming lessons with your students. So, yeah, I want to thank you. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Yumi. And I will see you guys at the next meeting. Well, no, Yumi knows. I might not see you guys for the next 2 months. I will be giving birth next month, so I will be out for just a little bit, but my sister will be here. So yeah, thank you guys.
Kasia, maybe you can open it up for questions. If it's okay, can you go out of the screen share?
Yes, yes.
There might be teachers who have some comments, and there were also some questions in the chat. For instance, Amy was asking, how long are your students' lessons? How much time do you devote to theory compared with technique and repertoire?
So a lot of my lessons are 45 minutes to 60 minutes. So I like to spend the first 10 minutes of each lesson on theory. And I like to devote that. For 60-minute lessons, I like to spend 15 minutes. It is a longer lesson. And then after I do the theory in the beginning, they already know, they whip out their skills, they whip out their homework. And I spend the first 10 to 15 minutes on their theory. And then we jump into the repertoire. It really does help them refresh and just sort of gain insight on all of the material that we will be working on for technique and performance for the rest of the lesson.
Yeah, great, thank you. And then the next question is Elaine is asking, do you give pieces in the key that they are working on?
Yes. So as we go on, I do like to do that just because it does help with the analyzation and performance aspect of them thinking in that way later on. So if they are in D major, I show them multiple pieces. In D major, I play for them and they pick whichever piece they'd like to study, and that's the piece that we work on. And so for the duration of however, depending on where we are, of course, some students take a little bit longer than others. Sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's 3 weeks. It depends really how fast the student is grasping the material. The more you do this structure, the faster they start to grasp it. So sometimes 2 weeks is enough for each scale. And then we work the rest of the repertoire until we are finished with the repertoire. And I don't go on until they have performed their rep in any kind of studio class or recital.
Mm-hmm. Great. Then you have some praise here. Christina wrote that she loves your passion, incredible enthusiasm, and amazing effort in coming up with the system. And Elaine wrote that she loved the train. And I want to catch on that. So we normally don't do sales pitches here, but you explained very well how you are playing teaching theory. And you had all these sheets on. So I might share, Kasia told me a couple of months ago that she published a new book. It's called the Scales Express Workbook, and the sheets that you saw are from this book. She's having it on Amazon. I wanted to support her and bought a copy. And I'm so sorry that you haven't never heard back from me, because I looked over it and I thought I like the design, I like the ideas, but I was thinking, wow, she covers so much. At the end of the book, it's almost like a college first theory 101. So that's why I think today's presentation was so valuable, because you explained how you do it and how we could use it. I know that there are a few Suzuki teachers here on the call, and we do group classes. For me, for instance, I cover every week performances, and then we go into theory and we do lots of games to make it friendly. And I was always thinking, I wish they could have something that they can take home, or a couple of weeks later look back, because you do these games and it's fun in the moment, and then next week they are forgetting this. So for myself, I can see, oh, this is something that I could use or work with my students. I looked you up on Amazon, and it's looks like it is out. We don't know when it is. Again, do you still?
Yes, so it is on Amazon, or you can get it off our website. I'll put the links in the chat. I appreciate the shout out. Thank you, Yumi.
Yeah, no, I'm very impressed. I know you only the secretary, and then I heard that you are a composer, that you conduct, that you run a big nonprofit. So thank you so much what you do for CAMTA and also for sharing your ideas. I think you gave us a lot of ideas how we can make music theory a little bit more fun and more systemized. Thank you. And with that, if there are not more questions, I give it back to Terry.
Thank you so much, Kasia. It was very, very interesting. I also love your idea of the train and picking up the passengers and giving them names. It's just delightful. And I know we're all gonna come away with lots of ideas to work with our students, and we really appreciate it. So thank you again.
Thank you guys. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And yeah, I will see you guys soon. You will be seeing more of my sister than me, but I will see you guys all soon. Thank you.
Well, we wish you all the best in your upcoming birth.
Thank you. Thank you guys.